What we're seeing right now is not just another spike in tension. It's a shift into a much more serious phase where escalation is no longer theoretical, it's visible and ongoing. Over the past few weeks, actions between the United States and Iran have moved beyond warnings and statements and into direct, measurable military activity. That alone changes how the situation is understood. This level of escalation is defined by frequency and intensity. It's not just one isolated event, it's a pattern. Strikes are followed by responses, and those responses are met with further actions. Each step builds on the last, creating momentum that's difficult to slow down. And when that momentum builds, it raises the overall risk level, not just for those directly involved, but for the entire region. Another key factor is the nature of the actions being taken. These are not symbolic moves or minor gestures. They're targeted, strategic operations aimed at capabilities, infrastructure, command systems, and operational reach. That tells you something important. The objective isn't just to send a message, it's to create real impact. And when both sides begin operating at that level, the situation becomes much more serious. For an American audience, what stands out is how quickly things have progressed. Situations like this usually develop over time, but here, the pace has accelerated. Developments are happening closer together, leaving less room for pause or reassessment. That compressed timeline adds pressure to decision-making because responses are expected faster, and the margin for delay becomes smaller. There's also a shift in visibility. Earlier stages of tension can often stay in the background, but once escalation reaches this level, it becomes harder to contain or downplay. Movements are tracked, actions are reported, and the global spotlight intensifies. That visibility brings its own pressure, because every move is now being watched, analyzed, and interpreted in real time. And as escalation reaches a critical level, it changes the overall environment. What was once a situation that could be managed through diplomacy alone now requires constant readiness. Military, political, and strategic elements all start operating together, creating a more complex and sensitive landscape where every action carries greater weight. What's becoming increasingly clear is that both the United States and Iran are no longer just reacting to events. They're actively preparing for multiple scenarios at the same time. This is what defines a true state of military readiness. It's not about waiting to see what happens next. It's about making sure that no matter what happens, there's an immediate and effective response already in place. For the U.S., this readiness shows up through a combination of visible and behind-the-scenes actions. Naval forces are positioned in key locations, air power is placed within rapid reach, and troops are either deployed or on standby, ready to move at short notice. These aren't random placements, they're carefully chosen positions that allow for quick reaction times, whether the situation requires defense, deterrence, or something more active. The goal is to eliminate delays, because in a fast-moving situation, time becomes one of the most critical factors. On the other side, Iran's readiness takes a different but equally serious form. Instead of relying on large-scale visible deployments alone, it often focuses on layered defense systems, regional influence, and the ability to respond through multiple channels. That includes missile capabilities, strategic positioning within the region, and maintaining a level of unpredictability that makes it harder for opponents to anticipate the next move. This approach creates a different kind of pressure, one that's less about visibility and more about capability. What makes this dynamic more intense is that both sides are aware of each other's readiness. It's not happening in isolation. Each move is observed, analyzed, and factored into the next decision. That creates a feedback loop where one side's preparation influences the others, leading to an ongoing cycle of increased alertness. For an American audience, the key takeaway here is how this level of readiness changes the nature of the situation. When both sides are fully prepared, the timeline for action becomes much shorter. Decisions that might have taken days or weeks in the past can now happen within hours. That speed increases the stakes because there's less time to pause, communicate, or de-escalate. There's also a psychological element at play. Military readiness isn't just about being prepared to act, it's also about signaling strength. It sends a message to the other side that any move will be met with a response. That message can act as a deterrent, but it can also raise tension because it reinforces the idea that both sides are ready for escalation if it comes to that point. And as readiness continues to build on both sides, it creates an environment where the situation is constantly on edge. Every movement, every signal, and every decision carries more weight because both sides have already positioned themselves to act without hesitation. What makes this moment especially complex is that two completely different paths are unfolding at the same time, and they don't cancel each other out. On one side, there are clear signs of military preparation. On the other, there are ongoing efforts to keep diplomacy alive. That creates a dual reality where conflict and negotiation are happening in parallel, and neither one fully defines the situation. For the United States, this approach is often strategic. Maintaining military pressure while leaving the door open for talks creates leverage. It allows decision-makers to negotiate from a position of strength, signaling that while diplomacy is preferred, there are other options ready if needed. This balance is delicate, because too much pressure can push the other side away from talks, while too much flexibility can be seen as weakness. At the same time, Iran operates within its own framework. Publicly, it may reject negotiations or deny that talks are even happening, especially when addressing domestic audiences or projecting strength internationally. But behind the scenes, indirect communication channels, often through intermediaries, can still be active. This allows space for dialogue without publicly conceding ground. The result is a situation where signals become harder to interpret. One day, reports suggest progress toward negotiations. The next, those same reports are dismissed or contradicted. Official statements may emphasize calm and restraint, while military actions suggest readiness for escalation. For observers, especially in the US, it can feel like the narrative is constantly shifting. This dual-track reality also affects how decisions are made. Leaders are not just choosing between peace and conflict, they are managing both at once. Every action has to be weighed against how it will impact not just the battlefield, but also the negotiating table. A move that strengthens one position could weaken the other, and finding that balance becomes increasingly difficult as tensions rise. There's also the question of timing. Diplomacy often requires patience, time to build trust, and space for communication. Military readiness, on the other hand, operates on speed and immediacy. When these two timelines collide, it creates pressure. Decisions may need to be made quickly, even while negotiations are still developing, which can complicate both processes. And as this dual reality continues, it adds another layer of uncertainty to an already tense situation. It's not just about what each side is doing, it's about how those actions fit into two very different strategies unfolding at the same time, each influencing the other in ways that aren't always visible on the surface. One of the biggest dangers in a situation like this isn't always a planned decision. It's a miscalculation. When tensions are already high, even a small misunderstanding can trigger a much larger reaction. And right now, that risk is growing as both the United States and Iran operate in an environment filled with uncertainty, pressure, and limited clarity. Miscalculation usually starts with interpretation. One side makes a move that it considers defensive or precautionary, repositioning forces, increasing surveillance, or responding to a perceived threat. But the other side may interpret that exact same move as preparation for something more aggressive. That difference in perception is where the problem begins. Because once a move is seen as a threat, the response that follows is shaped by that belief, not necessarily by the original intent. For an American audience, it's important to understand how quickly this can escalate. These aren't slow-moving situations where leaders have days to analyze and respond. When military forces are already on alert, decisions can be made and executed within hours. That compressed timeline leaves very little room to verify information, clarify intentions, or step back from a misunderstanding before it turns into action. Another layer of risk comes from the complexity of the environment itself. This isn't a simple one-on-one situation. There are multiple actors, multiple locations, and multiple channels of activity, from direct military operations to cyber actions and regional influences. That makes it harder to clearly connect cause and effect. An incident in one area might be linked to a decision somewhere else, or it might not be connected at all. But in a tense environment, it can still be treated as part of a larger pattern. Communication also becomes more fragile under these conditions. Official statements may be delayed, limited, or intentionally vague. Back-channel communication might exist, but it's not always strong or fast enough to prevent misunderstandings in real time. Without clear and immediate communication, assumptions start to fill the gaps, and those assumptions can drive decisions. There's also pressure on both sides to act decisively. No country wants to appear uncertain or unprepared, especially under global scrutiny. That pressure can push leaders to respond quickly, sometimes before all the facts are fully understood. In that kind of environment, even a cautious approach can lead to unintended consequences. And what makes miscalculation particularly dangerous is that once a response is set in motion, it's difficult to reverse. Actions trigger reactions, and those reactions create momentum. What might have started as a misunderstanding can quickly evolve into a real escalation, simply because each side is responding to what it believes the other is doing. What's often underestimated in situations like this is how quickly global impact starts to unfold, even before any full-scale conflict begins. Rising tensions between the United States and Iran don't just stay in the headlines. They ripple through the global economy in ways that directly affect everyday life, especially for an American audience. One of the first areas to react is energy. The Middle East plays a central role in global oil supply, and any instability involving Iran immediately raises concerns about disruptions. Key routes like the Strait of Hormuz become a focal point, because a significant portion of the world's oil passes through that narrow corridor. Even the possibility of disruption, not an actual shutdown, is enough to move markets. Prices can spike quickly, driven by uncertainty and risk rather than actual shortages. For people in the U.S., that impact can show up in very real ways. Gas prices can start to climb, sometimes within days. Transportation costs increase, which then affects the price of goods being shipped across the country. It's a chain reaction. Higher energy costs lead to higher costs in multiple sectors, from groceries to manufacturing. What starts as a geopolitical issue thousands of miles away ends up influencing everyday expenses at home. The financial markets also respond rapidly. Investors tend to move towards safer assets during periods of uncertainty, which can lead to volatility in stocks and other investments. Confidence becomes a key factor. When uncertainty rises, businesses and investors become more cautious. That caution can slow down economic activity, delay expansion plans, and create a more defensive financial environment. Travel and logistics are another layer of impact. Airlines may adjust routes to avoid certain airspaces, leading to longer flights and higher operational costs. Shipping companies face increased insurance premiums and may reroute cargo to avoid risk zones. These adjustments don't just affect companies. They influence delivery times, product availability, and overall efficiency in global trade. There's also a broader psychological effect that spreads across industries and decision-makers. When a situation like this dominates the global conversation, it shapes expectations. Businesses start preparing for worst-case scenarios, governments monitor conditions more closely, and consumers become more aware of potential economic shifts. Even without a direct conflict, the anticipation of what could happen begins to influence behavior. And as tensions continue to rise, that sense of uncertainty becomes a constant factor. It's not just about reacting to events, it's about preparing for possibilities. That ongoing state of alert affects how decisions are made at every level, from individual spending choices to large-scale economic planning. What makes this phase especially critical isn't just the tension itself, it's the uncertainty surrounding it. When a situation reaches this level, the biggest threat isn't always a direct action, but the fact that no one can say with confidence what happens next. For the United States and Iran, that uncertainty creates an environment where every decision carries more weight and every move is made with multiple possible outcomes in mind. In moments like this, there's no clear path forward. It's not obvious whether the situation will move toward de-escalation or intensify further. That lack of direction forces leaders to prepare for both possibilities at the same time. Military forces stay ready, diplomatic channels remain open, and contingency plans are constantly updated. It's a balancing act between caution and readiness, and maintaining that balance becomes increasingly difficult as pressure builds. For an American audience, what stands out is how quickly things can shift in this kind of environment. One development, a statement, an incident, a sudden move, can change the tone of the situation almost instantly. Markets react, media coverage intensifies, and policymakers adjust their approach in real time. That speed creates a sense that the situation is always on the edge of changing, even if nothing definitive has happened yet. Another key factor is how uncertainty affects decision-making. When information is incomplete or constantly changing, decisions have to be made based on probabilities rather than certainties. That increases the risk, because even well-informed choices can lead to unintended consequences. Leaders have to weigh not just what they know, but what they don't know, and that unknown factor can be significant. There's also a psychological dimension to this uncertainty. When both sides are unsure of each other's intentions, it can lead to more cautious behavior in some cases, but also more reactive behavior in others. A move that might normally be ignored could suddenly be seen as significant, simply because the environment is already tense. That heightened sensitivity makes the situation more fragile. Communication becomes even more important in this phase, but also more challenging. Messages need to be clear enough to prevent misunderstandings, yet controlled enough to avoid revealing too much. Public statements, diplomatic signals, and behind-the-scenes communication all play a role, but they don't always align perfectly. That gap can leave room for interpretation, and interpretation can drive action. And as uncertainty continues to dominate, it creates a constant sense of instability. It's not just about what's happening right now. It's about what could happen at any moment. That ongoing unpredictability shapes how governments, markets, and the public respond, keeping the entire situation in a state where even small changes can have outsized effects.